background stems from over 5 years of policy work at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. At NIST, he was the director of the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. Prior to that, he was the board member for NIST on the Internet Security and Privacy Advisory Board. He also served as the vice president of Global Government Affairs and Policy for Symantec Corporation, as well as the senior counsel for the U.S. Senate. Please help me welcome Mr. Green.
Muted. Not so good with technology, I guess. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. I appreciate everyone's attendance and sticking around to hear me. I'm going to talk a little bit about the different administration priorities over the past year, some things we've done that I'm happy to take some questions. So first, I'll talk a little bit about some of the things we saw in 2021 and touch on how they shaped the things that we were trying to do out of the White House, dig into those efforts a little bit, and then I'll close up briefly with some of the big initiatives that we and Congress and all the agencies are working together to improve long-term security and resilience of the country. So I'll start with what we've seen. Michael, one of our assistants, and I were talking a minute ago about how fast this year has gone. But it has not been a slow year in the cybersecurity world. When the administration came in, and I know this came up some this morning, we were still very much dealing with solar winds, mitigating the impacts of it, responding to the Russians, figuring out how best to handle that, and then really looking at the root causes. My first day with the NSC was March 1st. The immediate SolarWinds response effort was winding down, but the efforts to address it through potential legislation, through executive order, through other means were really hot and heavy at that time. Then on my second day, March 2nd, Microsoft released updates to 4 zero-day flaws in Exchange. And by the next day, there were tens of thousands of Exchange servers compromised worldwide. Thousands more were getting hit every hour. The National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, actually spoke about it on March 4th. Tweeted about it. And the next day, Jen Psaki, the press secretary, spoke about it from the White House podium. So it was a little bit of a trial by fire in my first week. First weekend was even more fun, as you all can probably imagine. But one thing that was clear to me after the first week, if it hadn't been coming in, was that cybersecurity was a top national and economic security priority to the administration, and that the most senior leaders in the White House were very much focused on it. So settled in a few months. We worked on executive order. I'll talk about that in a bit. I thought things had smoothed out. I'd actually gotten out early on a Friday. I was driving to see one of my kids' high school sporting events. Actually left early and discovered there still was traffic in Washington during COVID, and my phone rang. What was very clearly a U.S. government number, and that's when and how I learned about the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack that it had shut down. So I was sitting there in traffic debating whether I turn around and go back to the White House or head home, which was actually really moot because we weren't moving. But we'd been told by Colonial this was not that big a deal. They'd be up and running by the morning. Reflected a few days later, I probably should have asked which morning they were talking about, because as you all may or may not recall, it was quite a week working with them, trying to get them up to speed and understanding the long-term implications. Ransomware has always been pandemic levels at the individual level before criminals really turned to companies. But pre-colonial, there were countless companies being extorted. But that weekend and really the following week, ransomware became a national security issue in and of itself, the White House. And that was just reinforced a few weeks later with the JBS Foods ransomware attack. In the days after that, in addition to the cybersecurity aspects of it, my colleagues and I got to learn about and discuss in depth slaughter rates and kill floors, things that were not on my bingo card when I came to the National Security Council from NIST. And then you fast forward to the 4th of July week, Kaseya happened, and the president, as has been widely reported, actually held a National Security Council meeting that was focused on ransomware. So the spring and summer were pretty busy, but it turned out, as you all well know, they were really just a warm-up for the fall when we really started working aggressively with the interagency and the private sector to step up cybersecurity both in the federal government and in critical infrastructure in case the Russians actually did further invade Ukraine. This was an urgent effort. We were pushing hard, both trying to drive immediate security improvements across federal systems and private sector, but also to make sure that we had identified any foreseeable policy and legal issues to try to work out how we could move through them as quickly as possible and not let them get in the way of mitigation or response in the event we had an attack. Middle of all that, we had Log4j. I think that was the day before Thanksgiving. That set off another parallel urgent effort, first trying to identify what needed to be patched, and then at even a more basic level, were there patches to deploy, which version of the updated Log4j the patches covered. I know that a lot of the folks on this line gave up nights and weekends and holidays dealing with that. For what it's worth, leadership in the White House knows how hard people worked on that and very much appreciate it. But as you folks also know, this one's going to be with us for a long haul. Last week, Dark Reading did a report on just one search they had done that found 90,000 internet exposed servers that had a vulnerable version of Log4j. And that's really a snapshot of a subset of a subset of potential targets. Log4j really wove together several themes that had gone before in the year. Cybersecurity as the national and economic security issue I talked about, the need for better and more secure software and technology development, and the impact of open source vulnerabilities, just to name a few. Next slide, please. So there were a variety of issues. Thankfully, a lot of great work was done as well. Our host, DOJ, was very active. I think the DAG talked about some of that this morning, but at the very basic level, we have really appreciated watching how DOJ on the ransomware front has shifted its focus to really work more on disruption of criminal actors earlier and often, and that has paid off in ways that are public and not public. One great example was the very creative effort that DOJ and FBI did about the Hafnium web shell. It was an operation that protected thousands of potential victims. More recently, there was disruption of a botnet that was controlled by the Russian Federation's main intelligence directorate, and that activity disrupted the GRU's control over thousands of devices worldwide. And then not to mention the arrest and extradition of the alleged actor behind the Kaseya ransomware attack. So again, DOJ has been very active, and we much greatly appreciate that. I do want to talk a bit about the things that the White House has been working on. There are a lot of them. I'm going to hit the wave tops, and it'll be the wave tops of the lake that I was swimming in. So there are other things certainly in the cyber world we've done, but what you'll hear is from my perspective. The one thing I want to start with is something we were talking about a lot, literally a year ago. Got away from a bit as the executive order rolled out, but this is something that DNSA Neuberger really came in talking about. Is the idea that we have come to accept that we are constantly in a response mode, and that we need to step back and challenge whether this has to be the case as opposed to living through it. From my perch, both in and out of the government, we talked about, I was in the private sector for 8 years with a cyber company. Before that, I was on the Senate Homeland Security Committee watching these issues, and this has happened gradually. It's the proverbial slow boil. But now it feels like we are very much bouncing from response to response in a constant state of reactivity to the latest incident. The cost of the insecure technology that is often underlying these incidents is almost always borne at the end. It's through incident response and cleanup. But there's far more than monetary costs. There's lost privacy, there's stolen PII, there's the emotional impact on our citizens, and the potential loss for trust in the digital economy. And there's the threat to critical infrastructure that we became acutely focused on in the fall. This is just not something that DNSA Neuberger was willing to accept. And the idea that the cost of response should be borne by the victim is just not something we want to do going forward. And that really was baked into the approach in the executive order 14028. And when I started in March, that effort was underway. There's a great team here working on it, and I was privileged to get to work with them and help try to lead that effort. We had this issue of this idea of shifting the burden off of the end user when we were thinking about some of the pieces of it. But the EO also, and I'm going to dig into a few of them later, but the EO also tracked the administration's broader core cyber principles, building back better to modernize our defenses, returning to the international stage on cyber issues with our allies and partners, and sometimes with our adversaries, has proved somewhat useful at one point, and finally, better posturing ourselves to compete globally. The various pieces of the executive order, again, it's 14028, we're coming up anniversary. They reflect the lessons learned from SolarWinds and other incidents, Hackium, and ones that have gone before. Things like improving information sharing, securing our federal networks, building partnerships with government vendors to ensure that we get the information we need about incidents and even potential incidents, deploying key foundational technologies, multi-factor authentication, encryption, logging, improving our SOC capabilities, ensuring those basic security tools are in place. And finally, looking at our federal incident response networks, learning from the agencies and departments that do it the best and bringing up the baseline level for everyone else. Last point on the EO, and I think the most important, and I think Chris Inglis and the DAG talked about it this morning, is the reflection woven through the EO of our desire to partner with the private sector. We need the private sector needs us. There will always, having been on both sides of it in different parts of government, there's always tension there. Much of it is constructive tension. And what we tried to build into the EO was the idea that some of the pieces that would impact the private sector would be designed in a way for them to have early and strong input into, and I'll talk about that later. Next thing I wanted to hit on was our work securing critical infrastructure. This literally began on day one of the administration. One of our directors who blessedly left us but went to the Office of the National Cyber Director, so we still have his skills in this area. He began working on this on day one. The President's Industrial Control System Cybersecurity Initiative. We've got plans that are underway for three sectors: electricity, natural gas pipelines, and water. We're now working on the chemical sector. Each sector is very different. Each plan is very different. The measures of success and even how successful they're going to be is going to vary. But we're committed to finding the right approach for each sector, and that goes back to what I spoke of a minute ago, the public-private partnership. Also in this space, the President signed National Security Memorandum 5, entitled Improving Cybersecurity for Critical Infrastructure Control Systems. And one part, this formalized the Industrial Control Systems Initiative that I talked about, but it also directed CISA and NIST to develop performance goals for critical infrastructure sectors. The idea here is to create a common baseline of cybersecurity measures that are tailored to each sector or subsector, that are voluntary, but also give entities an idea of what we think they should be doing and what others on the outside might be looking for them to do. Ideally, and we've had a lot of work with NIST and CISA, these will both reflect the specifics of each sector and the reality that every company and entity is going to have different technology situations, different risk profiles, but some commonality is an important place to start. Last thing I'll touch on briefly is ransomware. This effort was not new. FBI, DOJ have been targeting these criminals for years. Others in government have been working it. CISA and DHS and DOE and other sector agencies have been working to strengthen the sector, the entities in their sector. And even in the NSC, we had an effort underway to identify a larger overarching strategy for ransomware before Colonial hit and before JBS. But those and other incidents brought significant additional attention, including, as I mentioned, from the President and more regularly from the National Security Advisor. So together with DOJ and these others, we've been working on various parallel efforts. We've had some of the successes I talked about. The Kaseya actor, we've also seen a fairly significant decrease in attacks on really structurally significant critical infrastructure. Important to note, we are still seeing very high-level attacks against critical infrastructure, generally hospitals, et cetera, but we have not seen something on the scale of JBS or Colonial, knock on wood, and hopefully we can keep that going. We've seen public infighting among some of the major ransomware groups, particularly after the Russian invasion, and some of them have shut down, some publicly attributing it to U.S. government or other government pressure. And when I talked earlier about working with more than our foreign partners, we even were able to get the Russians to take action after a fairly lengthy process of pushing. They arrested some of the key REvil actors, including one who was part of the Colonial attack. But obviously, this work is ongoing, and frankly, it is never going to end. We will, when and if we come up with a plan to defeat all ransomware, criminals will go elsewhere, and we know that. But our goal is to keep driving up the cost of doing business for them. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, starting in the fall, we had a whole government effort to prepare U.S. critical infrastructure against potential blowback from Russians' further invasion of Ukraine. I was talking with one of our senior folks yesterday, and we were marveling that it has been 5 months since early November. 5 months or 6, I can't even count anymore, 6 months. That time has gone incredibly quickly with the amount of effort we've had ongoing, wide range of activities, classified and unclassified briefings to literally thousands of private sector partners. You've seen numerous targeted cybersecurity advisories have come out. Safe to say there was some thinking put into why each of those came out when they did. We've done direct outreach. And again, this work, I should note, has been coordinated largely by CISA and to some degree by us, but the real heavy lifting is done at the agency level. I made a joke panel recently that the White House doesn't really do anything. We rely on the agencies and the departments to do all of the actual real work out there. I'm not sure my boss would love that one, but we do understand and appreciate the amount of line work that is done by the folks on this phone and elsewhere. So I'll stop there with the list of projects. It's obviously not complete. Numerous agencies have done a lot of work over the past year, over the holidays, and hopefully that gives you a sense of the overall efforts. Next slide, please. So I'll close with some talk about a few of the longer term efforts that we have underway that we think can provide structural security, for lack of a better phrase. I'm going to start by talking about software security, because I think that underlies a lot of the issues that we're having to deal with, and in particular, the need to build more secure software from the ground up. Stating the obvious, vulnerabilities are a persistent issue and will continue to be, whether it's software, hardware, embedded software. It is a bit frustrating that the scope of this problem hasn't changed over the past 20 years, because it's not that we don't know it needs to be addressed. It's not because of lack of effort, but it's obviously not an easy thing to fix, or someone would have done it already. The solutions aren't easy, but a lot of pieces to get together. And the sad reality is that attackers take advantage of known and patchable vulnerabilities all the time. Why work harder than you have to if you're a criminal? Or as someone said to me once, very few people get into crime to work hard. It would be a great day if we reached the point where the attackers had to hunt for 0 days and build complex attacks in order to be successful. But that's just not where we are right now. And that really comes back to the software issue I was talking about. Until we're building better and more secure software, we're going to keep seeing more preventable attacks. So I'll flip back briefly to the executive order. Section 4 of EO 14028 addressed the software supply chain and getting it more secure. In general, the EO is focused on the U.S. government, the things we need to do internally to improve our security. But 14028 does put requirements on private sector entities that wish to sell to the federal government. So starting, I think it was March 8th, but at some point in March of this year, vendors that want to sell software to the federal government will need to be following some form of secure development lifecycle practice. Now, NIST ran a process after the EO came out to identify some preliminary frameworks. They've put out some documents on it. So we want to give guidance, but the bottom line is vendors that are selling to the government need to be following these practices. We're still working on how this will be fully implemented, what an attestation might look like. OMB is doing some great work with the private sector on that right now, but the requirement is in place. The thinking behind this is really basic. We just cannot accept the mindset of build, sell, and then maybe patch it later. We need to get better back to building secure from the beginning. We don't have any conceit that we're the first to recognize this as a problem. It's known. There are various frameworks out there. But what we did do, I think, for the first time was put the power of the federal purse behind it and say that, we will shift the market as much as we are able in this direction. It'll take time. I believe it will have a lasting impact. I know from anecdotal feedback I've gotten from friends in the private sector that it has already had an impact. I've gotten calls and texts from friends who tell me two seemingly contradictory things, although I think you can reconcile. One is, you wouldn't believe how much time and money we're spending complying with this EO. And the second is, but we were already doing a great job anyway. And then some of them end with saying, but you're probably happy to hear that, in some frustration. And the answer is, I am. There are a lot of companies that are doing a lot of great work. It is good from our perspective for them to know they have to ensure that they're meeting these standards. And then there are a lot who simply may not have thought about it. One note I want to, we talked a lot about the impact on small businesses and did a fair amount of outreach. And there was not unanimity, but the majority of smaller businesses we talked to seem to believe that because they are nimble and more flexible and have fewer employees and potentially fewer projects, it would be easier and cheaper for them to switch gears. And some viewed that as a potential business benefit to them, and that was a good thing to hear. But we are watching to make sure that this process goes in a way that still keeps the marketplace open. The last thing I'll touch on very briefly is the efforts to remake our national critical infrastructure. And the two bills, the two laws are the American Rescue Plan and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And one thing on the Rescue Plan, there was over $1 billion in the Tech Modernization Fund. I know a lot of those applications for projects are now in, and the money is now starting to flow out to the agencies. And we're looking to see what lessons we can learn from that effort to make sure that we're providing support to the agencies to do the things that are in the executive order, EDR, NFA, encryption, things like that. The second thing is the bipartisan infrastructure law, a truly generational opportunity to rebuild our nation's infrastructure, to build new infrastructure. And in my little corner of the National Security Council, we are teaming up with one of the other directorates here, Resilience and Response, to ensure that as this new infrastructure is rolled out, it is both as secure as practicable from cyber attack and as resilient as possible to all hazards from the outset, whether we're talking electric grid, roads, bridges, pipelines, the new broadband. We need to build this secure from the ground up so we're not 10 years from now, as the saying goes, bolting the security on. We've worked closely with the infrastructure team that is located in the White House to help figure out a way to get this in. One last point I'd make on that I want to make clear is we are not advocating for selection of the most cyber secure infrastructure project. We think that the appropriate agency should pick the best projects based on that infrastructure need. And then we want to make sure that they're applying cybersecurity and resilience principles to that. So it is not a evaluation criteria in our view. It shouldn't be, are you the most cyber secure? Instead, it is, what is the best project for a specific area? Let me stop there. I've used up a bit of the time, but I appreciate again the opportunity and folks sticking through this with today, and happy to take some questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, sir. Our first question queued up is, what would be your recommendation to federal agencies to prepare for cyber attacks?
There are a lot of different levels at the federal agency you can take that. And we are still stuck in a world where most cyber attacks are preventable, either through all the basic cyber hygiene tools, whether it is patching and updating or multi-factor authentication. Hopefully, most federal agencies will all have some, but make sure you have multi-factor authentication and phish-proof multi-factor authentication rolled out. That can do a lot. If you are in a leadership position in an agency or within a component, go to your security teams ask them what your current status is, both to let them know that you view it as a priority and to let them know that you're going to be checking up on it. But unfortunately, we're still at a place where most of the protections start with making sure the basics are rolled out effectively.
Excellent. Next question. Are there any novel emerging threats that federal agencies should be aware of?
I think I need to think on that one. Actually, you stumped me a bit. I mean, I think the threat actors are evolving. As we said a month or so ago, we've definitely seen an evolution of intelligence in terms of what some of our more sophisticated adversaries might do. Two things I flag: the concern for potential destructive attacks from adversaries who may not have been willing to do that 6 months ago, and the second is criminal groups that historically were purely financially motivated. As we move into a potentially more polarized world, seeing criminal groups, highly skilled criminal groups, target U.S. government either for ransomware or data exfiltration or both. So I think the threats are probably about the same, but we're going to see an evolution of threat actors.
Excellent. Thank you, sir. And I think